Yesterday here was a great day. We did a lot of learning for Shavuot. I hope that many of you were able to enjoy our Siyum, our scholar in residence, Rabbi Dr. Candace Levy, one of my favorite teachers from Ziegler. She had a great learning that I'm glad that many of us got to enjoy. And after the learning, I was talking to one of our religious school parents, a very intelligent guy, and he doesn't really come to Torah study regularly. Torah study is not currently his thing yet, there's still time. And so I asked him, how was it? How was the learning? Well, and he said, well, the thing is, when you ask a question with Torah study, you can kind of have any answer. The Torah study was about boundaries, and so the one idea was when there is a boundary, the people who are outside the boundaries are most aware of them. Or maybe one could make the argument that people inside the boundaries are actually more aware than the people outside of the boundaries. He's kind of frustrated by this, saying it's not like there's a correct answer. It's not like, for example, an engineering project where you make a mistake and the plane crashes. And he also said, it's not like people are going to change their mind anyway once they've already made up their mind. This concept of this, there's no consequence of whether you have the right answer or not. There's no plane crashing that motivates us to get it right. And also this concept of being able to stay open to multiple correct answers and multiple correct perspectives. And so I tried to explain that it isn't really the aim of Torah study to have a right answer. It's more the aim to encourage people to explore perspectives that they haven't seen before and be open to changing their opinion. So I'm not sure how well that went over, but that's kind of what Torah study is about. And so this idea of multiple correct answers, I feel like there's a big important disclaimer here. This doesn't mean that every answer is necessarily a correct answer. Sometimes people make mistakes, they mistranslate words. There is such a thing as the wrong answer, but the more important point is that there are multiple right answers. So in this conversation with this person in our community I had yesterday, I came to understand in a new way a concept I've known about for a long time, and that concept is Torah lishma, Torah for its own sake. So when we're talking about the concept of boundaries yesterday in our learning, and whether people inside the boundary or outside the boundary are more aware of the boundary, who's more aware of the boundary, that conversation, that study, that intellectual exercise, it kind of feels like tossing around a baseball just for the fun of it, rather than playing an official game with teams and scorekeeping and a definitive outcome with a winner and a loser. Torah lishma isn't looking for a definitive outcome. It's about studying just to study, just to see where the learning takes you. So we're going to do a little Torah study lishma, Torah for its own sake this morning for the first day of Shavuot. And here's the topic. So as I mentioned earlier, in our religious school, we've been learning a lot in the past weeks leading up to Shavuot about the receiving of the Torah and the Ten Commandments. And we had several presentations yesterday by the students on this story from the Torah. And the part that really stuck out to me was the fire and thunder and the smoke and booming sounds. They did a great job acting that part out. And looking at today's Haftarah, it's filled with descriptions of crazy visions, the prophet's visions of God, storms and flashes of light, strange creatures, and a human form sitting on a throne. So what's going on with these strange experiences? Why are they in our Torah, and why do we read them on Shavuot? We're going to spend a few moments answering those questions and looking at those questions. So first, Shavuot is Zman Matan Toratenu. It's the time of the giving of our Torah. So of course it would make sense that we read the story of giving of the Torah when we originally received the Torah on this holiday, just like we read the story of our exodus from Egypt on Passover, because that's the holiday commemorating when it happened. Speaking of Passover, these two readings remind us also that these two holidays are connected. Passover happened first, it's Zman Cherutenu, the time of being freed from our slavery, and Shavuot, Zman Matan Toratenu, the time we were able to receive the Torah and truly become the Jewish people. God freed us from slavery in Egypt specifically for the purpose of receiving the Torah and taking on its spiritual, ethical, and intellectual responsibilities. So let's look a bit more at this description of Mount Sinai just as God was about to speak the words of the Ten Commandments. So in Hebrew we have Vahar Sinai Eshen Kivshan Mipnei Asher Yerad Alav Adonai Ba'esh Vayal Ashano Ke'eshen HaKivshan Vayecharad Kol Hahar Me'od. Mount Sinai was all in smoke, for God had come down upon it in fire. The smoke rose like a smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled violently. This is not a normal occurrence, as we know. And so Rashi, one of our favorite classical commentators, explains, why are we saying that Mount Sinai was like a furnace? Why is the Torah saying that the Mount Sinai was like a furnace? What this is said, Rashi explains, in order to make intelligible to the human ear, and I think the human mind, as much as it can understand. Scripture, meaning Torah, gives human beings an example or a comparison which is well known to them. We don't really know what it was like to have this happen when the Torah was given, but we do know what a smoking oven looks like, and so we can imagine it better because it's familiar to us. A similar case, Rashi explains, is a verse from the prophet Hosea, "As a lion does God roar." But, Rashi comments, who gave the lion power if not God? And yet Scripture compares God only to a lion. But the reason is that we describe God by comparing God to God's creatures in order to make intelligible to the human ear and the human mind as much as it can understand. A similar example this is from the book of Ezekiel, not the reading from today, but a similar phrase, and God's voice was like the sound of many waters. But who gave the waters a thunderous sound except God? And yet we describe God by comparing God to God's handiwork. It's all to make it intelligible to the human ear and the human mind. So the Torah is trying to describe something that we can't completely understand, but is doing so in a way that we will understand as much as we're possibly able to. So we have another verse, verse 19. This is the following verse from what I just read, the very next verse. Vayehi kol hashofar holech vechazak me'od, Moshe yedaber v'ha'elohim ya'anenu bakol. The blare of the horn grew louder and louder. As Moses spoke, God answered him in thunder. So this idea of the blare of the horn getting louder and louder, there's a couple of comments on this. So Rashi says, the manner of something ordinary, the manner of an ordinary person is that the longer he continues to blow the trumpet, the sound that he produces becomes weaker and fainter. But in this instant, it went on getting stronger. And why was it thus, i.e. not so loud at first? To make their ears receptive to as much as they were able to hear. So the idea here, explains Rashi, that it gets quiet and then louder and louder and louder because it's sort of, the metaphor trying to drink from a fire hose. So God is starting with like a little bit of Torah, and then as we get stronger and stronger in our ability to receive it, the blare of the horn gets louder and louder. And the Eitz Chaim actually has a beautiful comment on page 440. It says, ordinarily sounds grow more faint with time, making the same point. But it says, the words spoken at Sinai, however, echo as loudly today as when they were spoken more than 3,000 years ago. So as if the blare of the horn continues until today because we continue to study these words. So I'm really struck by these comments all saying that the point of Torah is to be able to hear it and understand it. It should be accessible. And then we should be able to understand Torah more and more as time goes on. So I've been reading this book called The Triumph of Life by Rabbi Yitz Greenberg. I've mentioned it before. And I was just reading a section where he makes the claim that Torah is progressively moral. And he uses the example of slavery. Today we know slavery is wrong. In the Torah, slavery is permissible given very specific instructions, like you need to let your slave rest on Shabbat. Now, by the time we get to the Talmud, which is historically later on, slavery is in practice not permissible because there's a rule saying you can have a slave only if you pay your slave the same wage that you yourself earn. So that's not going to happen. But at the time of giving of the Torah, slavery was part of human culture and human experience, unfortunately. And so it was a big ask from the Torah to bring into this situation of slavery the morality of having your slave rest on Shabbat, sharing your gift of Shabbat with your slave. And perhaps this is showing how we can understand more and more of Torah as time moves on. I am inspired by this idea because it means we get to improve as a human people and as a Jewish people over time. So let's look for another moment at the Haftarah. Towards the end, we're going to look at Ezekiel's description of God seated on a throne and come back to our questions. What exactly is going on here? Why do we read this on Shavuot? And so I'll read 3 verses, 26 through 28. I'll read them in English this time. Above the expanse over their heads was the semblance of a throne. So we've got this big throne above their heads. So this is crazy to me. An appearance like sapphire. And on top, upon this semblance of a throne, there was the semblance of a human form. From what appeared as the loins up, I saw a gleam as of amber, what looked like a fire encased in a frame. And from what appeared as the loins down, I saw what looked like fire. There was a surrounding radiance. Like the appearance of the bow that shines in the clouds on a day of rain, such was the appearance of the surrounding radiance. It was multicolored. When I beheld it, I flung myself down on my face, and I heard the voice of someone speaking. So again, very, very unusual circumstances here. And we have a great comment on this in our Eitz Chaim Chumash. It's on page 1324. It's a comment on verse 28. And it speaks about the phrase presence of the Lord, and it says literally, this Hebrew word is kavod. That's the specific word that we're talking about here. So the divine kavod in the Bible is frequently associated with the appearance of God. It was substantive and sometimes anthropomorphic. It was like a thing. Now, for medieval Jewish philosophers like Saadia Gaon, the divine kavod was a created form made by God, so that the light would give God's prophet assurance of the authenticity of what was revealed to him. So we've had this conversation in our weekly warm-up Torah study. How do we know that what the prophets receive is true? Well, it's authenticated by these crazy visions. Now, Moses Maimonides held a similar view to this. So the divine kavod was actually distinct from God. It wasn't actually God, but it was an authentication of the godliness of the prophecy. Now, the medieval Kabbalists had a completely different view. The kavod was actually a modality or an expression of God, and this expression of God was a focus for meditation and speculation. So this brings us back to the beginning of our learning to where we started. We have two different answers, and neither is definitively correct. So studying Torah, it's less about correct answers, it's more about exploration, even about play, perhaps about learning to embrace the validity of opinions that are different from our own, which is a difficult ask for most of us, right? But perhaps another reason for studying Torah, something on a more somber note that occurred to me as I continued my reflection when I heard the news yesterday about the terror attack, the anti-Semitic terror attack in Boulder. This world doesn't make sense. You know, there are moments when the world seems logical, and then there are moments that defy logic. It's not logical how our people are so hated and have been so hated for so long. All we were doing was expressing ourselves peacefully. So there's this concept in psychology, especially post-pandemic, of resilience, of being able to withstand and recover from difficulties. So today on Shavuot this year, I'm appreciating anew how studying Torah for its own sake over the generations has helped our people be resilient in this world that doesn't make sense. Torah doesn't often ask us to find the one correct answer, but it does often ask us to try to understand things in a new way. It makes our minds and our souls strong and flexible. It gives us the strength that we have as Jews to stand up and speak out. It gives us the courage and the creativity to establish and implement security procedures that enable us to be proudly ourselves while we gather as community. This week, of course, we will all be mindful of the situations around us, and we as a community will continue our ongoing conversation about how best to keep one another safe. And as we do so, we will appreciate our Torah, how our traditions and generations of study has prepared our minds and our hearts to take on all the challenges we face today. Chag Sameach.